Li Jian stood at the center of the collapsing chamber and understood, in the space of one breath, that he was alone. He turned once, searching for the 11 men and women he had trusted since the day the gods first marked their names among the stars. Not one remained. The dust where they had stood was already settling. Their retreat had been quiet, careful, deliberate. Nobody had shouted a warning. Nobody had even said goodbye. They had simply gone, the way rats leave a sinking ship before the water rises, and left him facing something that could kill 100 armies. He did not scream. He did not beg the empty air to bring them back. He only stood there, sword loose in his hand, listening to the thing behind him breathe. This was the moment everything after would trace back to. Not the 20 years that followed. Not the tower, or the fire, or the silence. This exact second, when the strongest of the 12 Zodiac Saints realized his family had chosen their own skins over his life. Rewind that memory back far enough and it starts somewhere simpler. It starts with a man who believed loyalty meant something. 20 years ago, before the world called him a myth, before children whispered his name like a bedtime warning, Li Jian was already known as the strongest combatant among the 12. He never wanted the mansions the other saints collected, or the parades held in their names. He wanted calamities gone. Not managed, not contained behind walls while sanctuaries profited off the fear. Gone. He used to argue this point loudly enough that some of the others rolled their eyes, tired of his stubborn idealism, tired of a man who refused to accept that the system worked exactly as intended for the people running it. The Devil Tower sat at the edge of the world like an old wound that never fully closed. Calamities inside it did not behave the way calamities behaved anywhere else. They came back. Kill one, and another crawled up from somewhere no light reached. The tower had already swallowed entire expeditions of skilled fighters, leaving only rumors and cautionary tales behind. When the 12 saints were finally ordered to enter it together, Li Jian volunteered to take point without hesitation. He always did. It was the kind of decision that made people admire him from a distance and resent him up close, because his courage made their own caution look smaller. They descended in a tight formation at first. Torches, whispered strategy, the occasional nervous joke from Hugo to break the tension. Hugo Otter, the Sagittarius saint everyone called Tyson behind his back because of his stubborn grin and thicker frame, walked near the rear, watching the group's flanks the way he always did. He and Li Jian had fought side by side since they were young enough to still get scared before battles. That kind of history builds a particular sort of trust, the kind that doesn't ask questions before jumping into danger for someone. The deeper they went, the worse the tower became. Corridors that shouldn't have connected did. Screams echoed from directions that led nowhere. And then they reached the chamber where Scarlet Eyes waited. A calamity so old that most sanctuaries treated its name as a ghost story, meant to frighten disciples into obedience. It was not a ghost story. It was very real, and its first attack put 3 saints on the ground before anyone finished drawing a weapon. Li Jian pushed forward anyway. Someone had to hold the line while the others regrouped, and he had never been the type to wait for someone else to volunteer first. He carved through the outer swarm of smaller creatures the dragon commanded, buying seconds that felt like hours, trusting that when he turned around his allies would be there, ready to finish what they started together. They weren't there. He would replay that turn 1,000 different ways over the following decades, trying to understand the exact second his family decided he was expendable. Had it been planned before they entered the tower? Had someone given a signal he missed in the chaos? Or had raw terror simply made the decision for them, one heartbeat at a time, until the retreat became unanimous without a single vote? It didn't matter which explanation was true. The result sat in front of him regardless. An empty chamber, a monster that refused to die, and 11 names he would never trust the same way again. Yang Wei, the Aries saint, had been among the first to run. History would later remember him differently. History would remember him as a hero who barely escaped with his life, a survivor of an unwinnable battle, a man who mourned his fallen comrade with dignified grief in front of cameras that hadn't existed yet but would one day capture every polished lie he told about that day. None of the footage would show what actually happened. None of it would show him glancing back at Li Jian once, calculating the odds, and choosing his own survival without a flicker of guilt crossing his face. Inside the chamber, the fight that followed lasted long enough to break a lesser man's spirit into pieces too small to reassemble. Scarlet Eyes did not simply attack, it devoured effort itself, forcing Li Jian to relearn how to fight with a wounded arm, then eventually with no arm at all after a strike he barely avoided cost him more than he expected. The dragon revived from apparent death not once, but repeatedly, each time slightly changed, slightly harder to predict. Something deeper in that tower kept feeding it back to life. He would not learn what for years. Between fights, in the brief silences the tower allowed him, he thought about the people who left. Not with rage at first, with a strange, quiet confusion, the kind that comes before anger finally arrives to fill the space. He kept expecting a rescue party. He kept listening for footsteps that never came. Somewhere around the third month, he stopped listening. Loneliness became a heavier weight than any wound. He talked to himself sometimes just to remember the sound of a voice that wasn't a monster's roar. He rationed food from creatures he killed, learned which parts of the tower offered brief safety, built small shelters out of debris that the tower itself seemed to resent and eventually destroy. He counted days by scratching lines into stone until the numbers stopped meaning anything. At some point, survival stopped being the goal and became simply a habit his body refused to break, even when his mind grew tired of carrying it. He used to imagine what his old friends were doing. Whether Hugo ever mentioned his name, whether anyone had told his family the truth, or whether they'd been fed the same polished lie the public eventually swallowed whole. He learned, much later, that Hugo had never stopped believing he might be alive. That knowledge would matter enormously one day. In the tower, he had no way of knowing it, and the not knowing hollowed something out of him that never fully grew back. Years folded into each other. He stopped aging the way normal men age, whether from the tower's strange properties or something in the countless deaths he survived along the way. His hair grew long and tangled, scars layered over scars until his own arms felt foreign to him. He fought creatures that had no names, learned patterns that no sanctuary training had ever prepared him for, and slowly, without noticing the exact moment it happened, became something closer to a weapon than a man. The final enemy waited at the tower's deepest point, a figure the others never spoke of because none of them ever went far enough to encounter it. The tower administrator did not fight the way calamities fought. It commanded them instead, reviving what died, adjusting the tower's structure like a puzzle designed specifically to grind down whoever entered. Scarlet Eyes had been dangerous. The administrator was the reason Scarlet Eyes never stayed dead. Li Jian fought it for what felt like a lifetime folded inside the lifetime he'd already lost. He won, eventually, though victory arrived without the satisfaction he once imagined it would carry. There was nobody left to celebrate with, no allies waiting outside to cheer his name, just silence, and a tower beginning to shake itself apart from the inside. He remembered thinking, as the ceiling started collapsing around him, that dying here felt almost fitting. 20 years of isolation, ending in a place nobody would ever find his body. The betrayers would keep their reputations. History would keep its comfortable lie. He would simply vanish, the way inconvenient truths often do when nobody survives to speak them. The tower buried him beneath more rubble than a mountain should have contained. And then, impossibly, it didn't end there. Something ancient stirred in that darkness, a presence that had waited far longer than 20 years for the right person to find it. A serpent's mark burned itself into his skin, quiet at first, then spreading like ink through water, rewriting something fundamental about what his body was allowed to be. He felt his consciousness stretch and snap and reform along lines that made no sense to a mind that had only ever understood saints and calamities and nothing else. When his eyes opened again, the tower around him no longer existed. Only rubble, sky, and two frightened teenagers crouched nearby, staring at the stranger who had apparently just crawled out of an explosion that shouldn't have left anyone alive. He didn't recognize his own hands at first. Younger, stronger, unmarked by decades of scarring that should have been permanent. His voice came out rougher than he remembered, and hunger hit him with a force that embarrassed him slightly, given everything else that had just happened. The two survivors, still shaking from whatever calamity had chased them into this ruin, explained cautiously that monsters had attacked their neighborhood and that most people didn't come back from encounters like that. They spoke carefully, the way people speak to someone they're not sure is dangerous. He asked, bluntly, what year it was. Their answer landed harder than any blow he'd taken in the tower. 20 years, not months, not a handful of seasons he'd simply lost count of in the dark. 2 full decades had passed while he fought alone in a place that swallowed time along with everything else. The world the two teenagers described sounded almost unrecognizable. Saints had become celebrities with fan followings and public sanctuaries. Disciples now trained under formal ranking systems that hadn't existed when he entered the tower. Devices in people's pockets apparently held more information than entire libraries once did. He listened to all of it with the strange, distant feeling of a man being told about a country he used to live in that had rebuilt itself entirely without him. When he finally asked about the 12 zodiac saints by name, the boys answered without hesitation, listing names he remembered from a lifetime that suddenly felt impossibly far away. Yang Wei's name came up first, spoken with the kind of casual reverence people reserve for celebrities they've never actually met. Hero of the Devil Tower disaster, one boy called him, a survivor everyone respected for the sacrifice he'd apparently made trying to save his comrades. Li Jian said nothing for a long moment. The rage that filled that silence didn't announce itself loudly. It simply settled into him, cold and permanent, the way frost settles into ground that will now take an entire season to thaw. He asked what happened to the man who never came back from that tower, the one who had actually stayed to fight while everyone else escaped. The boys exchanged a glance. One of them said quietly that nobody talked about him much anymore, that his name had faded into a footnote in most retellings, a tragic casualty rather than the reason anyone survived that day at all. Something shifted behind his eyes in that moment, though his face barely changed. 20 years of silence, and the people he'd trusted with his life hadn't even bothered keeping his memory honest. They'd rewritten the story until the man who abandoned him became the man remembered as a hero, and the man who actually fought and bled and lost everything became a name nobody thought worth repeating. He decided, standing in the wreckage of a tower that no longer existed, that this rewriting would not survive contact with the truth. Every saint who walked away from that chamber 20 years ago would learn exactly how wrong they'd been to assume silence meant surrender. A faint hiss curled through the air around him, and he felt it before he saw it. Scaled and ancient, a presence he somehow already understood without needing explanation, coiled itself into existence beside him, patient and watchful. The tower had given him more than survival. It had marked him as something outside the old order entirely. A seat among the gods that had never existed until this exact moment. Notifications flickered across his vision, unfamiliar and strange, offering him information no ordinary saint had ever possessed. Stats, progress, something called a workshop, waiting to be explored. He barely understood any of it yet, but understanding could come later. Right now, only one priority mattered enough to hold his full attention. He needed clothes that fit properly, food that didn't taste like tower rubble, and a very long list of names. The two boys watched him stand, winced slightly at muscles still remembering how to move without decades of scar tissue, and asked them, almost gently despite everything simmering underneath, whether the nearest town had anywhere selling roasted meat. They blinked at the question, clearly expecting something more dramatic from a man who had apparently just survived the impossible. He didn't offer them drama, not yet. That would come soon enough. Delivered personally to every sanctuary that had built its wealth on his supposed death. The town nearest the ruined tower site was smaller than he remembered, though he supposed that made sense given 20 years of rebuilding around a wound the earth itself hadn't fully healed. The two boys, whose names he learned were Minu and Daehyun, walked ahead of him with the cautious energy of people leading a stray animal they weren't entirely sure wouldn't bite. He didn't blame them. He probably looked like something that had crawled directly out of a nightmare, clothes reduced to scraps, skin marked with a serpent's pattern neither of them could stop glancing at. They explained things as they walked, filling gaps in a world he'd missed entirely. Sanctuaries now operated almost like small kingdoms, each built around a single saint's reputation and blessed territory. Faith, apparently, had become currency in ways it never used to be. The more people believed in a saint, worshipped at their shrines, spoke their name with reverence, the stronger that saint's connection to their god grew. It explained something that had always felt slightly off about the old system. Back when saints quietly competed for followers, instead of openly campaigning for them, the way modern sanctuaries clearly did now. Disciples, Minu explained, with the pride of someone reciting something he'd studied carefully, were awakened through direct contact with a saint's power. Once awakened, they climbed a hierarchy that started at the bottom, with barely ranked initiates, and stretched all the way up to the mythical SS tier, reserved for the zodiac saints themselves. Below that sat the 10-star candidates, disciples powerful enough to be considered future saints in waiting. Below them came divine captains, then the more common A, B, and lower ranks that made up the bulk of every sanctuary's forces. Li Jian absorbed all of it quietly, filing away details that would matter later, though privately he found the entire structure faintly absurd. 20 years ago, saints existed to fight calamities. Now they apparently existed to manage armies of ranked followers competing for status inside carefully branded kingdoms. Daehyun mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that avatars had also become far more common since gods began actively projecting themselves into the world through them. Manifestations that could fight, negotiate, or simply represent a god's will without the god needing to appear directly. Only gods controlled them, as far as anyone knew. Li Jian filed that fact away too, though he had no idea yet how directly it would apply to him within days. By the time they reached the edge of town, word had apparently already started spreading. Not about him specifically, not yet, but about strange sightings near the tower ruins. A few nervous shopkeepers glanced his way as he passed, though nobody said anything directly. He supposed a shirtless man covered in old scars and fresh serpent markings drew a certain kind of attention regardless of the era. He found clothes first, practical and plain. Purchased with a handful of coins Minu insisted on lending him despite clearly not having much to spare himself. Small kindness, freely given, from someone who owed him nothing. He noted it quietly, the way he noted most things now, filing it under the short and growing list of things this new world had gotten right. Food came next, and here his hunger finally overwhelmed whatever restraint he'd been holding on to. He ate with the single-minded focus of a man making up for 2 decades of ration survival, working through more food than either boy had probably ever seen one person consume in a single sitting. Neither of them commented, though Daehyun did glance sideways at Minu with an expression somewhere between amusement and concern. It was Minu who eventually found the nerve to ask the question they'd both clearly been holding back. Who exactly was he, and how had he survived something that had killed entire expeditions? Li Jian considered several answers before settling on the truth, mostly because lying felt like more effort than he currently had patience for. He told them his name. Neither boy reacted the way he expected, confusion mostly, followed by the kind of careful, humoring silence people use when they think someone might be a little unwell. Minu finally said, gently, that Li Jian had died 20 years ago in the Devil Tower, alongside 11 other saints who'd barely escaped with their lives. Everyone knew the story. It got taught in schools now, held up as a tragic example of the tower's danger. He asked flatly, what version of the story got taught exactly? Daehyun answered this time, clearly more comfortable with details than his friend. The official account described a heroic last stand, where Li Jian sacrificed himself buying time for the others to escape a calamity none of them could have survived together. Yang Wei's account, given shortly after the incident, formed the backbone of most retellings. He'd apparently spoken about it publicly many times over the years, always with visible grief, always praised for his honesty about how close they'd all come to dying that day. Li Jian set down the food in his hands slowly. Something in his expression must have shifted, because both boys instinctively leaned back slightly. He didn't sacrifice himself for anyone, he said quietly. He'd been abandoned, left alive, left fighting, while 11 people ran and later built careers out of grieving a man they'd chosen to leave behind. Neither boy argued with him, though he could see the disbelief still sitting behind their eyes. It didn't matter yet whether they believed him completely. The seed was planted. That would be enough for now. He asked one more question before letting them go, one that had been sitting heavier than the others since they mentioned it earlier. What had happened to his family, his belongings, anything that might have survived him after his declared death? Minu hesitated before answering. As far as he knew, the Ares Sanctuary had handled most of the arrangements, given that Yang Wei had been his closest surviving comrade. Any relics or property Li Jian left behind would have gone through them. That single sentence did more to focus his intentions than anything else that day. Not vague, distant justice against some faceless system. A specific sanctuary, a specific man, still walking around this world wearing the reputation Li Jian had bled for. He thanked the boys, meant it more than his tone probably suggested, and told them to go home before dark. They hesitated before leaving, Minu glancing back once with an expression that suggested some small part of him wanted to believe the impossible stranger's story, even if logic told him not to. Alone again, Li Jian allowed himself a rare moment of stillness, sitting on a low wall at the town's edge, letting the weight of everything settle properly for the first time since waking beneath the rubble. 20 years, a stolen legacy, A world that had rebuilt itself entirely around a lie. He pulled a discarded phone from a nearby trash bin, more out of curiosity than any real expectation it would work, and to his mild surprise it powered on. Modern technology, it turned out, had advanced considerably. He fumbled through unfamiliar interfaces with the patience of someone determined not to be defeated by a small glowing rectangle after surviving decades of literal monsters. Eventually he found what he was looking for. Public records, memorial pages, news archives celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Devil Tower incident that had occurred just months earlier. He read through article after article, each one reinforcing the same narrative Daehyun had described. Yang Wei's face appeared prominently in most of them, solemn and dignified, accepting condolences for a loss he had personally engineered. One particular passage made something cold settle permanently into his chest. A quote, attributed directly to Yang Wei, describing how Lee Jion's final moments had been the bravest thing he'd ever witnessed, how he thought about his fallen friend every single day, how the Ares Sanctuary had taken personal responsibility for preserving his memory and legacy. Preserving his legacy, apparently, meant absorbing his surviving relics into their own vault, quietly redirecting any inheritance meant for family he no longer had, and building an entire public mythology around a man who couldn't contradict any of it because everyone believed him dead. He found records of achievements too. Battles Lee Jion had fought alone, later reframed as joint efforts led primarily by Yang Wei, monsters he'd killed single-handedly, credited to teams that arrived only after the real danger had passed. The pattern repeated across article after article, each small theft compounding into something enormous over 2 decades of unchecked revision. His grip on the phone tightened until the cheap plastic casing cracked audibly. He set it down before it shattered completely, breathing slowly, forcing the rage back into something he could control rather than something that controlled him. Anger wouldn't fix this. Precision would. He needed information before confrontation, and the fastest way to gather it, he decided, was simply to walk toward wherever Sanctuary influence gathered most visibly. If Ares Sanctuary controlled his stolen legacy, their territory would be the logical place to start. The walk into the city proper took most of the remaining daylight, and with every step the modern world revealed itself further. Massive shrines dedicated to individual saints rose above ordinary buildings, banners displaying zodiac symbols hanging from nearly every intersection. People wore small charms marking devotion to specific sanctuaries, the way old-world citizens once wore religious symbols without much thought about the systems behind them. He passed a gathering crowd near a public square where several young disciples stood on a raised platform, clearly demonstrating abilities for onlookers. Their uniforms bore the twin symbol emblem of Gemini Sanctuary, polished and confident, clearly enjoying the attention. One of them, a lean young man with an arrogant tilt to his posture, noticed Lee Jion watching from the crowd's edge and apparently decided he made an easy target for a demonstration. He called out, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, asking if the ragged stranger wanted to test his strength against a real disciple. Lee Jion considered ignoring him entirely. Then he considered how satisfying it might feel not to. He stepped forward without hurry, and the disciple's confident grin widened, clearly interpreting the movement as intimidation successfully applied. He gestured for 2 of his companions to join him, apparently deciding one-on-one wasn't dramatic enough for the growing audience. They attacked together, coordinated and fast by ordinary standards, each strike backed by genuine training and real ability. To anyone else in that crowd, it would have looked like a dangerous, skilled assault against an unarmed stranger. Lee Jion flicked one finger against the first disciple's forehead, sending him crashing backward into a market stall hard enough to collapse it entirely. The second received the same treatment a heartbeat later, folding to the ground without even managing to complete his swing. The third, the arrogant one who'd started this, froze mid-motion, staring at his fallen companions with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning terror. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Lee Jion didn't gloat. He simply turned and kept walking, leaving 3 unconscious disciples and an audience that would spend the rest of the day trying to explain what they'd just witnessed to anyone who would listen. By nightfall, whispers had already begun spreading through the city's lower circles about a mysterious stranger who'd humiliated Gemini disciples without visible effort. Nobody yet connected the rumor to anything larger. That would change soon enough. He found an abandoned apartment complex on the city's outskirts, one clearly marked for demolition, and claimed a quiet corner to rest properly for the first time in longer than he could easily calculate. Sleep came harder than expected, old instincts refusing to fully release their grip even now that the tower's dangers were finally behind him. Notifications flickered across his vision again as he settled, offering fragments of a system he still barely understood. Experience gained from the disciple encounter, materials collected from something he hadn't consciously realized he'd looted during the brief scuffle, a prompt mentioning something called a workshop, still locked, still waiting for requirements he hadn't met yet. He studied the interface for a long while, testing its edges, learning its rhythms the way he'd once learned the rhythms of every calamity inside that tower. Understanding this system, he suspected, would matter as much to his revenge as any raw strength he'd carried out of that collapse. Morning arrived with a plan taking clearer shape. Confront Yang Wei directly would come eventually, but rushing that confrontation without proper preparation felt like the kind of mistake that had gotten him abandoned in the first place. 20 years ago, he'd trusted people who didn't deserve it. He wouldn't repeat that particular failure by trusting his own impatience now. Instead, he decided, he would learn everything about the world Ares' sanctuary had built on his supposed death before tearing it down piece by piece. Their fake relics, their exploited followers, their carefully maintained image, all of it deserved exposure before the final confrontation, not after. He found his answer to where that investigation should begin while passing a small residential district still marked, faintly, with old Ares sanctuary blessing symbols above several doorways. A neighborhood, he realized, that had once fallen under his own informal protection before the tower swallowed 20 years of his life. If any physical remnant of his old belongings survived, it would likely have passed through here first, before eventually reaching Ares' hands. An elderly shopkeeper, sweeping her doorstep as he approached, glanced up and offered the kind of polite nod strangers usually receive in quiet neighborhoods. He asked, carefully, whether she remembered the apartment complex that used to belong to one of the old Zodiac saints, the one who died in the Devil Tower. Her expression shifted immediately into something more guarded. She remembered, she said slowly. Everyone in this district remembered him fondly, actually, more fondly than most saints earned. He used to personally intervene when calamities threatened this specific area, something the newer saints rarely bothered doing themselves anymore. He asked what happened to his apartment after his declared death. She hesitated before answering, glancing briefly toward a nearby building bearing a small Ares emblem above its entrance. Ares' representatives had come shortly after the official announcement, she explained, claiming his belongings needed to be cataloged and preserved as sanctuary property, given that he'd left no surviving family to inherit anything directly. Preserved, apparently, meant absorbed entirely into Ares' own growing collection. She mentioned one more detail, almost hesitantly, as though unsure whether it mattered. Several items removed from that apartment later appeared displayed publicly within Ares Sanctuary's main hall, presented to visiting disciples as sacred relics blessed by the Ares god itself. She'd always found that strange, given that most of what she remembered him owning had been simple, practical items rather than anything obviously divine. Fake relics, manufactured from stolen mundane belongings and dressed up with false divinity to inspire faith and donations. The picture assembling itself in his mind grew uglier with every new piece. He thanked her, offered a small bow of respect that clearly surprised her given his rough appearance, and turned his attention toward the Ares emblem marking that nearby building. Not the main sanctuary yet, just a satellite location, likely storing lower priority relics and administrative records. A good place to start pulling threads before the entire tapestry came apart. The satellite building carried none of the grandeur of what he assumed the main sanctuary must look like, but it still bore the unmistakable polish of an institution that wanted to look trustworthy from the outside. Clean stone steps, a modest shrine near the entrance where a handful of worshippers knelt, murmuring quiet prayers toward a small statue bearing the ram horn symbol of Ares. Li Jian studied their faces as he passed. Ordinary people, hopeful, tired, the kind who probably gave whatever small coin they could spare in exchange for a blessing they were told might protect their families from calamity. He felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest, watching them. 20 years ago, faith like this had meant something simpler. People believed in saints because saints occasionally showed up to save them. Somewhere along the way, that arrangement had curdled into something closer to a transaction, dressed up in old language to make the exploitation feel sacred. He walked past the worshippers without drawing attention, slipping toward a side entrance reserved for sanctuary staff. A pair of low-ranked disciples guarded the door, more concerned with looking important than actually watching for threats. He waited until their attention drifted, then simply walked past them entirely, moving with a quiet control over his own presence that made people's eyes slide off him without quite registering why. Inside, the building smelled of incense and old paper. Administrative offices lined one hallway, storage rooms another. He moved methodically, checking rooms without disturbing anything unnecessarily, searching for anything connected to his own name. He found it in a records room 3 doors down, shelves lined with cataloged items each tagged with careful handwriting. Most meant nothing to him, but near the back, in a locked case gathering dust in the corner, he recognized a ring he hadn't seen in 20 years. It had belonged to his mother, one of the only possessions he'd carried with any sentimental weight during his years as a saint. The tag beside it read, in elegant script, Blessed Ember Band, divine artifact of the Aries bloodline, donated by Saint Yang Wei in memory of the fallen. Donated. As if he'd given it away. As if Yang Wei had shown generosity by placing it here, instead of simply stealing it outright and dressing the theft up as reverence. He broke the case open with a single motion, retrieved the ring, and turned it slowly in his fingers. It hummed faintly against his skin, a small residual warmth he remembered from childhood, nothing close to the divine power the tag falsely promised. A worthless trinket to anyone without the memory attached to it. Priceless to him for reasons that had nothing to do with the label Yang Wei had invented. He kept searching. More items surfaced as he moved deeper into the storage room, each carrying similarly fabricated titles. A cracked leather bracer labeled as a sacred guard of the fallen hero. A simple iron dagger, nothing more than a tool he remembered sharpening himself countless times, now displayed as a weapon blessed by divine sacrifice. None of it carried actual divine power. He could feel that clearly now, with senses sharpened by whatever the tower's system had rewritten inside him. Fake relics, exactly as the old shopkeeper suggested, manufactured from ordinary belongings and sold to a public desperate to believe their faith meant something tangible. A ledger sitting open on a nearby desk caught his attention next, filled with transaction records he hadn't expected to find so easily accessible. Names of disciples, amounts donated in exchange for blessings supposedly tied to these fabricated relics. Numbers large enough to explain exactly why Ares Sanctuary had bothered manufacturing this elaborate fiction in the first place. Further down the ledger, another category of entries drew his focus. Notes referencing something called avatar deployment fees, alongside smaller sums marked as territory maintenance. He didn't yet understand the full mechanics, but the pattern felt uncomfortably clear. Civilians paying, directly or indirectly, to fund a system that primarily protected sanctuary interests rather than the civilians themselves. He pocketed the ledger, along with the small collection of stolen belongings, and continued deeper into the building. A locked door at the hallway's end radiated a faint, cursed energy he recognized instantly, the kind that had occasionally infected relics even during his own time as a saint. He forced it open without hesitation. Inside sat perhaps a dozen relics, each carrying the same corrupted signature. He examined one closely, a polished amulet that practically glowed with false divine light to untrained eyes. Beneath that glow, hidden in the object's actual structure, he sensed something else entirely. A subtle thread connecting the amulet back towards some distant point outside the building, quietly transmitting information. Spying relics. Objects sold to civilians as protection, secretly designed to monitor their activities or, worse, attract exactly the sort of calamity they claimed to guard against. He thought immediately of the 2 boys who'd found him near the tower ruins, wondering how many families had unknowingly invited danger into their homes through relics purchased in good faith from an institution they trusted completely. Rage settled into something colder and more useful than it had been that morning. This wasn't only about his own stolen legacy anymore. This was about how thoroughly Ares Sanctuary had chosen profit over the people they were supposedly sworn to protect. He gathered every cursed relic in the room and destroyed them one by one, methodical and unhurried, watching each corrupted signature dissolve into harmless dust. Whatever satisfaction the act offered came wrapped in a heavier understanding of exactly how deep this corruption ran. Footsteps echoed from somewhere near the entrance, hurried and alarmed. Someone had apparently noticed his intrusion. He didn't bother hiding. 3 disciples rounded the corner moments later, weapons drawn, faces caught somewhere between confusion and alarm at finding an unfamiliar man standing amid destroyed relics and broken display cases. Their leader, slightly older than the others, demanded to know who he was and what right he had trespassing inside sanctuary property. Li Jian considered several answers before settling on the simplest true one. He told them he was reclaiming property that had never belonged to Ares' sanctuary in the first place. The leader's expression shifted toward genuine anger, apparently deciding intimidation would work better than questions. He ordered the other two to restrain the intruder while he summoned reinforcements. They rushed forward together. Li Jian sidestepped the first attack without visible effort, redirected the second disciple's momentum into a nearby shelf hard enough to collapse it, and caught the leader's blade between two fingers before it came anywhere close to striking him. The disciple stared at his own weapon, trapped uselessly in a stranger's casual grip, with the particular horror of someone realizing they'd badly misjudged an opponent. Li Jian released the blade, letting it clatter uselessly to the floor, and walked past all three men without further comment. None of them found the courage to pursue him. Outside, evening had begun settling over the city, painting the sky in shades that reminded him, briefly and unexpectedly, of sunsets he used to watch from sanctuary walls before any of this began. He allowed himself exactly one breath of stillness before continuing forward, ledger and stolen relics tucked securely away, mind already working through what came next. Word of the incident, he suspected, would reach Yang Wei faster than he might expect. He was right. Across the city, inside considerably grander walls, Yang Wei sat within his private study, reviewing reports that had begun arriving with unusual frequency over the past several days. At first he'd dismissed them as nothing more than the ordinary chaos any large sanctuary occasionally weathered. A supermarket calamity outbreak here, several unexplained disciple defeats there, minor property damage attributed to unknown assailants nobody could adequately describe. Individually, each incident meant little. Together, a pattern had started forming that gnawed uncomfortably at the edges of his composure. His personal attendant entered without knocking, something she rarely did, carrying a fresh report with visible unease written across her face. She explained that the Eastern Satellite Storage Building had just reported an intrusion. 3 disciples defeated with what witnesses described as almost contemptuous ease. Several relics stolen, cursed items destroyed, a ledger detailing certain sensitive financial arrangements missing entirely. Yang Wei's expression remained composed on the surface, the same practiced calm he'd maintained through 2 decades of public appearances and carefully rehearsed grief. Underneath that surface, something colder began stirring. He asked for a description of the intruder. His attendant hesitated before answering. Witnesses described a tall man, unusually strong, moving with an ease that defied normal expectations for someone apparently untrained in any recognized combat style. No sanctuary affiliation, no visible relics or divine markings, aside from an unusual serpent pattern along his forearm that nobody could identify. Yang Wei's hand tightened slightly around the report in his fingers, though his face gave nothing away. A serpent pattern. He told himself it meant nothing. Serpent imagery appeared across dozens of minor faiths and forgotten constellations. Coincidence, surely. Anything else felt too impossible to seriously entertain. Still, he found himself dismissing his attendant more curtly than usual, needing a moment alone to process feelings he didn't fully understand yet. He walked to the window overlooking his sanctuary's main courtyard, watching disciples move through their evening training routines below, oblivious to whatever quiet unease had settled over their leader. 20 years he'd spent building this reputation, this legacy, this comfortable and profitable mythology constructed carefully atop a single afternoon's decision he rarely allowed himself to examine too closely. He remembered that decision clearly, whenever memory forced its way past the walls he'd built specifically to keep it contained. The chamber. Scarlet eyes bearing down on all of them with a fury none of their training had prepared them for. Li Jian pushing forward, buying time, expecting the rest of them to hold formation and support him the way they'd supported each other through years of shared battles. He remembered the exact moment his own nerve broke completely. The precise second survival instinct overwhelmed whatever loyalty he'd once genuinely felt toward the man who'd saved his life more times than he could easily count. He'd told himself, in the years since, that staying would have meant certain death for everyone, that his retreat had actually been strategic wisdom rather than cowardice, that Li Jian, given his stubborn nature, would have wanted the rest of them to survive rather than die alongside him accomplishing nothing. He almost believed it some days, Other days, usually late at night when the sanctuary's grandeur felt hollow rather than earned, he remembered the truth plainly. He had run, they had all run, and he had simply been the one skilled enough afterward to construct a narrative flattering enough to survive public scrutiny. A knock at his door interrupted the memory before it could sink any deeper. Another attendant, this one younger and more nervous, informed him that Gemini Sanctuary had reported a related incident. Several of their own disciples humiliated publicly the previous evening by a stranger matching a similar description. Yang Wei felt something cold settle fully into his chest now, refusing to be reasoned away as easily as before. He asked whether Gemini leadership had drawn any conclusions about the stranger's identity. The attendant admitted they hadn't, though rumors had already begun circulating among lower disciples, wild speculation ranging from a rogue divine avatar to some entirely new saint nobody had properly registered yet. Yang Wei dismissed the attendant and remained alone with his thoughts far longer than he intended. Eventually, almost against his own will, he found himself retrieving an old, carefully hidden portrait from a locked drawer in his private study. One he hadn't looked at directly in years. 12 figures, young and confident, standing together before their first mission as fully recognized zodiac saints. Li Jian stood at the center, exactly where he always ended up standing in every photograph from that era. Not through arrogance, but simply because everyone naturally gravitated toward him during moments that mattered. He studied that face for a long moment, searching for some rational explanation that would make his growing unease disappear entirely. He found none. Somewhere across the city that same evening, in a quiet gathering hall belonging to the Aquarius Saint, a very different reaction unfolded. News of the mysterious intruder had already reached this sanctuary too, carried through informal channels that connected saints across supposedly separate territories more closely than the public ever realized. The Aquarius Saint, an older woman known for her careful, measured judgment across decades of service, listened to the reports with an expression that steadily shifted from polite interest into something considerably more alarmed. When her attendant finished summarizing the descriptions, she remained silent for nearly a full minute before finally speaking. She asked, quietly, whether anyone had mentioned specifically how the intruder moved, not simply his strength but the manner of his fighting style itself. Her attendant, slightly confused by the specific question, relayed what witnesses had described: efficient, economical, almost dismissive toward opponents, as though genuine combat required no meaningful effort from him at all. The Aquarius Saint closed her eyes briefly, a gesture her attendants rarely witnessed from a woman known throughout the sanctuary for unshakable composure. She had fought alongside Li Jian exactly once, decades earlier, during a joint operation neither the official records nor public memory bothered preserving in any detail. She remembered his fighting style precisely, the particular economy of motion that made devastating force look almost casual. She'd never forgotten it, mostly because nothing she'd witnessed since had matched that same unsettling efficiency. She told her attendant, carefully, to increase security around her sanctuary immediately, without offering further explanation. The attendant left confused but obedient, unaware of exactly what unspoken fear had prompted such an abrupt decision. Alone again, the Aquarius Saint allowed herself a single quiet thought she would never speak aloud to anyone. If Li Jian really had somehow survived, and if 2 decades of solitary suffering inside that tower had shaped him into whatever force these reports now described, then every saint who'd participated in his abandonment, herself included through her own passive silence afterward, had considerably more reason to fear the coming days than any of them currently understood. Meanwhile, entirely unaware of the ripples his actions had already begun sending through sanctuary circles, Li Jian settled back into his makeshift shelter for the evening, laying out the stolen ledger and studying its contents more carefully now that immediate danger had passed. The numbers painted an increasingly damning picture. Faith-based donations flowing steadily into Ares' coffers, a significant portion diverted toward personal accounts rather than any stated charitable or protective purpose. Payments recorded from various businesses across the city, labeled vaguely as protection fees, that felt uncomfortably close to extortion dressed up in religious language. And scattered throughout, smaller entries referencing something called avatar suppression costs, expenses apparently covering the deliberate underreporting of minor calamity incidents to maintain public confidence in sanctuary competence. He thought of the supermarket incident he'd heard mentioned briefly by Minu and Daehyun days earlier, an outbreak apparently downplayed significantly in official reports. He wondered how many similar incidents across the city had received the same careful minimization, civilians left unaware of genuine ongoing danger simply to protect a sanctuary's polished public image. His system notification chimed softly, an unfamiliar sound he was still adjusting to, informing him that reviewing the ledger's contents had unlocked additional information relevant to future confrontations. He examined the interface curiously, finding a new option labeled Evidence Compilation, allowing him to catalog specific proof against specific targets for later use. It occurred to him, studying that option, that his revenge didn't need to remain purely personal. 20 years ago, he'd fought to eliminate calamities because innocent people deserved protection nobody else seemed willing to properly provide. That instinct hadn't died inside the tower alongside everything else he'd lost. If anything, watching how thoroughly Ares' sanctuary had betrayed the very civilians they claimed to protect only sharpened that old conviction into something considerably more focused. He would destroy Yang Wei's reputation, certainly. But he would also expose exactly how deep this corruption ran, ensuring that whatever came after his revenge left the world genuinely safer, rather than simply rearranging which corrupt sanctuary held power. Sleep came easier that night, settled by purpose rather than exhaustion alone. Tomorrow, he decided, he would continue gathering evidence, testing the limits of his new abilities, and slowly tightening the net around every person who'd assumed his death meant permanent silence. He had no way of knowing yet that fate itself would accelerate his plans considerably sooner than expected. Somewhere across the city, an ancient calamity long thought successfully sealed had already begun stirring restlessly beneath a supermarket's ordinary foundations, indifferent to any timeline he'd carefully constructed for his revenge. Some confrontations, it seemed, refused to wait for convenient timing. Morning brought with it a hunger that felt almost comically ordinary compared to everything else weighing on his mind. 20 years inside a tower that offered nothing but scavenged monster flesh had left him with an appreciation for real food bordering on obsession, and after another restless night poring over Ares' ledger by moonlight, his stomach had firmly reasserted itself as the day's most urgent priority. He found a modest supermarket a few blocks from his shelter, its windows plastered with faded advertisements for products he didn't recognize. Inside, the fluorescent lighting felt almost aggressively bright after weeks spent adjusting his eyes to tower darkness and dim city streets. He moved through the aisles slowly, marveling briefly at the sheer variety available before impatience won out and he simply began gathering anything that looked edible in quantities that made a nearby stock clerk pause mid-restock to stare. He was midway through debating the merits of 2 different brands of canned chicken when the front doors burst open with considerably more violence than any customer should have caused. A man sprinted through the entrance at a speed no ordinary human could manage, weaving between startled shoppers with the loose, coiled ease of someone accustomed to running from consequences. Behind him, 2 disciples wearing unfamiliar insignia gave chase, shouting for him to stop, their own speed impressive by normal standards, but visibly inadequate against whatever ability the fleeing man possessed. Li Jian recognized the signature immediately, though he'd never encountered this particular ability before. Something tied to acceleration, likely drawing on whatever divine blessing Scorpio Sanctuary offered its disciples. The thief clutched a bag stuffed with stolen goods against his chest, expression caught somewhere between exhilaration and genuine panic. He didn't particularly care about the theft itself. He cared considerably more about the fact that the man's frantic weaving had just knocked an elderly shopper hard enough to send her sprawling into a display of canned vegetables. Li Jian stepped into the thief's path without hurry, catching him mid-stride with a single open palm against his chest. The impact stopped the man instantly, as though he'd run into a wall rather than a person, the stolen bag flying from his grip and scattering its contents across the floor. The 2 pursuing disciples arrived seconds later, breathing hard, staring first at their captured target and then at the stranger who'd apparently stopped him without visible effort. Before anyone could speak, the entire building shuddered. Not the gentle tremor of nearby construction or passing traffic, but something deeper and wronger, a vibration that seemed to originate from beneath the supermarket's foundation itself. Fluorescent lights flickered. Products rattled off shelves. Somewhere near the back of the store, a section of flooring cracked open with a sound like breaking bone. Something vast and many-legged began emerging from the widening fracture. Li Jian's senses, sharpened considerably since the tower, immediately identified the signature radiating from whatever climbed free of that crack. Old, dangerous. Sealed, apparently, though whatever containment had been placed on it clearly hadn't survived intact. The queen spider unfolded itself fully into the supermarket's central aisle, easily the size of a delivery truck, chitinous legs scraping deep gouges into tile flooring as smaller spider-like creatures poured out around it in a chittering wave. Panic erupted instantly. Shoppers screamed and scrambled toward exits, several tripping over fallen products in their haste. The two disciples who'd been chasing the thief abandoned their pursuit entirely, retreating several steps with expressions that suggested their training hadn't remotely prepared them for something at this danger level. The thief, still pinned beneath Li Jian's palm, went pale enough that his earlier panic over being caught looked almost quaint by comparison. Li Jian released him without ceremony. Whatever punishment theft deserved could wait considerably longer than the chaos currently unfolding around them. He assessed the situation with the same efficient calculation he'd once applied to tower calamities. Dozens of civilians still trapped between the queen spider's position and the store's main exits. Smaller spiders spreading rapidly through the aisles, cutting off secondary escape routes. The two disciples, clearly overwhelmed, doing their best to herd fleeing shoppers toward whatever exit remained accessible. He moved before finishing the thought completely, closing the distance toward the nearest cluster of trapped civilians in 3 strides. A spider lunged toward a young mother shielding her child behind an overturned shopping cart. Li Jian intercepted it mid-leap, with the can of chicken still gripped in his free hand, crushing the creature's exoskeleton on impact hard enough that several onlookers actually flinched at the sound. He kept moving, using whatever happened to be nearest to hand as a weapon, rather than wasting time drawing anything more deliberate. A second spider fell to a thrown jar of pickles that shattered against its skull with lethal precision. A third met its end against a mop handle that Li Jian snapped in half with a single strike, driving the broken end through its exposed underside. The absurdity of it registered distantly even as he worked. A man capable of fighting a tower's worth of calamities alone, reduced to killing spiders with groceries. He supposed there was something fitting about it, given how thoroughly this new world seemed determined to strip away whatever dignity his old reputation once carried. His system chimed steadily as each kill registered, though the notifications felt secondary to the more immediate priority of clearing a path toward the trapped shoppers. He herded 3 separate groups toward the store's side entrance personally, physically lifting a child over a spreading collection of debris when the boy's mother couldn't manage it fast enough herself. The queen spider, meanwhile, had begun turning its attention away from the scattering smaller shoppers and directly toward him, apparently recognizing the source of its swarm's mounting losses. It reared back on its hind legs, venom glistening visibly along mandibles easily large enough to bisect a grown man. Li Jian set down the can of chicken he'd somehow still been holding, an act that felt almost comically domestic given what stood before him, and turned to face the creature directly. The two disciples, having successfully guided most remaining civilians toward the exit, hesitated near the doorway, clearly torn between fleeing themselves and some lingering sense of obligation to help the stranger now facing this threat alone. Li Jian called out to them without turning, voice carrying easily over the swarm's chittering, instructing them to get everyone else clear and stay clear themselves. This wasn't a fight civilians or underleveled disciples needed to witness up close. One of them, the younger of the two, opened his mouth as though to argue. The other grabbed his arm and pulled him firmly toward the exit instead, apparently possessing better instincts for recognizing a fight well outside anyone's ability to meaningfully assist. Alone now with the queen spider and its remaining swarm, Li Jian rolled his shoulders once, testing the still unfamiliar weight of a body only recently reconstructed by whatever power the tower had granted him. The creature struck first, mandibles snapping shut where he'd been standing a half-second earlier. He'd already moved, closing distance rather than retreating, driving a fist into one of its many joints hard enough to shatter chitin and elicit a shriek that rattled every remaining window in the building. A serpent's aura began coiling visibly around him as the fight intensified, dark and ancient, responding to whatever instinct or command his new nature offered, without needing conscious direction. The queen spider seemed to recognize the danger this aura represented, retreating half a step for the first time since emerging from its crack. Though retreat came too late to matter, he drove it backward through successive strikes, each one landing with enough force to crack the reinforced flooring beneath them both. The creature attempted one final desperate lunge, venom-laced mandibles aimed directly at his throat. He caught them barehanded, ignoring whatever corrosive burn the venom carried against his skin, and simply pulled, tearing the massive jaw apart with an audible, wet crack that finally ended the confrontation entirely. The queen spider's body collapsed in a final shudder, its remaining swarm scattering in immediate disarray without their queen's guidance to hold them together. Li Jian dispatched the remaining stragglers with considerably less effort than the main battle had required, methodically clearing the supermarket of every last threat within a few short minutes. Silence settled over the wrecked store afterward, broken only by the soft hum of flickering fluorescent lights and his own steady breathing. His system chimed again, more insistently this time, offering something beyond the usual experience notification. Materials collected: queen spider chitin, venom glands, silk sacs. Crafting components unlocked. A new option flickered into view labeled simply Production, still requiring further development before becoming fully accessible. He examined the fallen creature's remains with fresh interest, understanding dawning slowly that this system offered him considerably more than simple combat strength. Whatever he could build from these materials might prove just as valuable as raw power moving forward. Outside, the two disciples who'd fled earlier had apparently gathered a small crowd near the supermarket's entrance, all staring through shattered windows at the scene inside, with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright awe. Word of what happened here, he suspected, would spread considerably faster than he might prefer at this early stage of his plans. He gathered as many crafting materials as the system allowed him to claim, along with the groceries he'd originally come for, and made his way toward the exit, stepping carefully around debris and the occasional twitching remains of smaller spiders. The gathered crowd parted instinctively as he approached, nobody quite finding the courage to speak directly to the man who'd apparently just solo cleared a calamity outbreak that should have required an entire sanctuary's coordinated response. He was halfway through the crowd when a new group arrived, moving with the purposeful urgency of officials responding to an emergency rather than curious bystanders. Gemini Sanctuary insignia marked their uniforms, several disciples flanking a figure whose bearing suggested considerably higher rank than the ones he'd humiliated in the street days earlier. Their leader took one look at the wrecked supermarket, the scattered spider remains, and the stranger emerging casually from the wreckage carrying groceries, and something in his expression shifted rapidly from professional composure toward genuine alarm. He demanded to know what had happened here, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. Li Jian considered several responses before settling on brevity. He told him a sealed calamity had escaped and been dealt with, and that civilian casualties had been avoided entirely thanks to prompt evacuation. The Gemini official's eyes flicked toward the two disciples who'd originally responded to the thief's pursuit, silently demanding confirmation. Both nodded, still visibly shaken, one of them adding quietly that the stranger had fought the queen spider entirely alone and won without apparent difficulty. The official's composure cracked slightly further at that confirmation. He glanced back toward the supermarket's interior, toward the sheer scale of destruction a single calamity of that classification typically caused, and then back toward the ordinary-looking stranger, standing before him with a bag of groceries in one hand. Before he could ask anything further, a new voice cut through the gathered crowd, sharp with barely controlled urgency. Someone from deeper within Gemini's ranks had apparently just received communication regarding a considerably less noble response being prepared elsewhere in the city. The messenger, out of breath from running, reported that senior sanctuary leadership had already discussed containment protocols for this exact scenario, protocols that involved considerably less concern for the supermarket's remaining structural integrity or anyone who might still be inside it. Li Jian's expression hardened as the implication settled fully. He asked, directly and without softening the question, exactly what these protocols involved. The messenger hesitated, clearly uncomfortable delivering this particular information in front of a stranger, but the Gemini official present nodded permission for him to continue. Containment through demolition, the messenger explained reluctantly. If a queen spider infestation reached this severity, standard sanctuary procedure called for sealing and destroying the affected structure entirely, minimizing any risk of secondary outbreaks or reputation damage from prolonged public exposure to the incident. Evacuation orders, when issued at all, typically prioritized ranked disciples and sanctuary personnel first. Ordinary civilians still trapped inside supermarkets, apparently, ranked considerably lower on that particular priority list. Li Jian felt something old and familiar settle back into his chest, the same cold recognition he'd carried since reading Yang Wei's carefully constructed lies. 20 years had passed, an entire generation had grown up under this system, and somehow the fundamental calculation remained exactly the same. Protect reputation first. Protect the people actually in danger only if convenient. He turned his attention fully toward the Gemini official, voice carrying an edge sharp enough that several nearby disciples instinctively took a half-step backward. He told him that no demolition order would be executed, not while civilians potentially remained unaccounted for inside, and not while he stood here to prevent it personally. The official opened his mouth, likely to explain protocol or jurisdiction or any number of bureaucratic justifications, and then visibly reconsidered given everything he'd just witnessed regarding this stranger's capabilities. Instead, he simply nodded, ordering his own disciples to begin a proper search for any remaining trapped civilians before any containment decision proceeded further. It wasn't gratitude exactly motivating that decision. Li Jian recognized simple self-preservation when he saw it, but it would serve the same purpose regardless. As disciples fanned out to begin their search, Li Jian noticed movement near the crowd's edge, a familiar broad-shouldered figure pushing through onlookers with the kind of urgent focus that suggested he'd heard something concerning enough to abandon whatever he'd been doing beforehand. Hugo Otter stopped dead the moment his eyes landed on the supermarket's wrecked entrance, and then, more importantly, on the man standing amid the wreckage holding a bag of groceries, like nothing unusual had happened at all. Something in his expression shifted through confusion, disbelief, and finally something considerably rawer, though he clearly hadn't yet allowed himself to fully believe what his instincts were already screaming at him. Li Jian met his old friend's gaze across the wreckage, and felt, for the first time since walking free of that collapsed tower, something other than cold calculation settle behind his ribs. Hugo didn't move for several long seconds, standing frozen at the crowd's edge with an expression that kept trying to settle on disbelief and failing every time his eyes tracked back to the stranger's face. Something about the posture, maybe, or the particular way he held himself, even while doing something as mundane as carrying groceries through a disaster site. Whatever it was, it refused to let Hugo simply walk away and dismiss the resemblance as coincidence. He approached slowly, disciples and onlookers parting around him without really registering that they were doing it. Up close, the differences became more obvious. Younger skin, a face reconstructed by whatever process had rebuilt this man from nothing. Nothing that matched the friend Hugo remembered from 20 years of shared battles and shared meals, and shared exhaustion after missions that should have killed them both a dozen times over. He asked, voice rougher than he intended, who he was. Li Jian set the groceries down on a nearby overturned cart, unhurried, and studied his old friend's face for a moment before answering. He said his name plainly, the way he had with the two boys days earlier, offering no embellishment or proof beyond the simple fact of it. Hugo's jaw tightened. He said, carefully, that Li Jian had died 20 years ago. Everyone knew that. He'd spent years hoping otherwise, searching quietly where the official story didn't quite add up, and eventually accepting what everyone else already had. Li Jian's expression didn't change much, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes at that admission. He asked whether Hugo had genuinely searched or simply told himself he had to ease his own guilt. The question landed harder than any physical blow could have. Hugo's composure cracked slightly, old grief surfacing faster than he could suppress it. He said he'd searched for years, quietly, without sanctuary support, without anyone else believing there was any point. He'd refused every attempt to formally close the case, refused the inheritance that would have come to him as Li Jian's closest surviving comrade, refused to let the official narrative settle comfortably into his own memory the way it had for everyone else. Li Jian watched him carefully as he spoke, weighing the words against 20 years of assuming every single person he'd once trusted had simply moved on without a second thought. He asked, more gently than anything he'd said to anyone since waking beneath the tower's rubble, whether Hugo remembered a particular argument they'd had years before the tower mission. A stupid, trivial disagreement over which of them made a worse tactical decision during a routine calamity cleanup. One that had ended with both of them laughing too hard to actually finish the argument properly. Hugo's breath caught audibly. Nobody else could have known about that argument, It had never been recorded anywhere, never repeated to anyone else, existing only in the private memory shared between two men who'd trusted each other completely before everything fell apart. His composure finally broke entirely. He stepped forward and gripped Lee Ji-yeon's shoulder hard enough that his knuckles went white, staring at his face as though trying to reconcile 20 years of grief with the impossible reality standing in front of him. His voice, when he finally managed to speak, came out barely steady. He said he'd never stopped believing, somewhere underneath everything, that Lee Ji-yeon might still be out there somehow. He just never allowed himself to hope for it directly, because hope like that, left unanswered for 20 years, had a way of becoming its own particular kind of cruelty. Lee Ji-yeon didn't offer easy comfort in return. He simply let the moment settle, allowing Hugo the space to process something that clearly upended 2 decades of carefully managed grief in the span of a single conversation. Around them, disciples continued their search through the supermarket's wreckage, occasionally calling out updates that confirmed, gradually, that every civilian had made it clear before the Queen Spider's rampage claimed any lives. Small mercies, though Lee Ji-yeon noted grimly that the mercy owed entirely to his own intervention rather than any genuine sanctuary concern for the people trapped inside. Hugo finally released his grip, though he remained close, studying his old friend's face, as though still afraid he might simply disappear again if given the chance. He asked, quietly, what had actually happened in that tower, why it had taken 20 years, why nobody had ever found a trace of him despite searches he personally insisted on funding out of his own resources for years after everyone else gave up. Lee Ji-yeon considered how much to explain here, surrounded by disciples and officials and civilians still processing their own narrow escape. He decided the full truth could wait for somewhere more private. For now, he offered only the barest outline. He'd survived. He'd fought alone for 2 decades. He'd emerged changed, in ways that went considerably beyond simple physical recovery. Hugo absorbed this with visible restraint, clearly wanting more detail immediately, but recognizing this wasn't the moment to demand it. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden shift in the crowd's energy, murmurs rippling outward from the street beyond the supermarket's entrance. Lee Ji-yeon felt it before seeing it, a familiar divine signature approaching rapidly, one he recognized instantly despite 20 years separating this moment from the last time he'd sensed it directly. Yang Wei arrived, flanked by a small entourage of high-ranking disciples, his expression carrying the practiced calm of a man accustomed to commanding attention wherever he appeared. That composure lasted exactly as long as it took him to survey the scene before him. A wrecked supermarket, a dead queen spider visible through shattered windows, Gemini disciples working under orders that clearly hadn't originated from his own sanctuary, and Hugo standing entirely too close to an unfamiliar stranger for the situation to feel remotely normal. His eyes moved across the gathered crowd, cataloging details with the efficiency of a man who'd spent 20 years carefully managing every variable that might threaten his carefully constructed reputation. They landed eventually on Lee Ji-yeon, lingering there slightly longer than anywhere else, though nothing in his expression suggested immediate recognition. He addressed Hugo first, voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone long accustomed to public appearances. He asked what exactly had transpired here, and why Gemini disciples appeared to be operating under instructions contradicting his sanctuary's standard containment protocols. Hugo opened his mouth to answer, clearly torn between explaining the situation properly and simply staring at Yang Wei with newly reawakened suspicion, given everything Lee Ji-yeon's return implied about the tower's true history. Lee Ji-yeon answered before Hugo could settle on a response, stepping forward slightly, voice carrying an edge that immediately drew Yang Wei's full attention away from Hugo entirely. He said the containment protocol Yang Wei referenced would have killed every civilian still trapped inside, all to protect a reputation for competence that clearly meant more to Ares' sanctuary than the actual people it claimed to protect. Yang Wei's composed expression flickered, just slightly, at the directness of the accusation. He studied the stranger more carefully now, something uneasy stirring beneath his professional mask that he couldn't quite identify yet. He asked, with careful neutrality, who exactly this stranger was to speak with such authority about sanctuary protocols he had no apparent standing to criticize. Lee Ji-yeon held his gaze steadily, letting several seconds pass before answering. He told him his name. The reaction rippled through Yang Wei's entourage instantly, several disciples exchanging uneasy glances, clearly recognizing the name's significance, even if they couldn't process the implications properly. Yang Wei himself went very still, The kind of stillness that came from a man forcing every muscle in his body not to react visibly to something his mind was still refusing to fully accept. He said, after a long pause, that this was impossible. Li Jian had died 20 years ago in the Devil Tower. He'd personally witnessed the tragedy. He'd spent years honoring his fallen comrade's memory. Li Jian's expression hardened at that particular claim. He asked whether honoring someone's memory typically involved absorbing their stolen relics into a private vault, manufacturing false divine artifacts from their personal belongings, and claiming credit publicly for accomplishments that had cost the actual person everything to achieve alone. Yang Wei's carefully maintained composure finally cracked visibly, something raw and defensive surfacing beneath 20 years of practiced grief. He insisted this stranger was clearly some imposter, someone attempting to exploit Li Jian's legacy for personal gain, and that sanctuary security would handle the matter appropriately. He gestured sharply toward his accompanying disciples, several of whom stepped forward with weapons already drawn, clearly prepared to act on whatever order followed. Li Jian didn't move, didn't reach for any weapon of his own, simply watching Yang Wei's rapidly unraveling composure with something approaching cold satisfaction. He said that if Yang Wei genuinely believed him an imposter, he was welcome to test that belief personally, rather than hiding behind disciples who had no idea what they were actually being asked to fight. The challenge landed exactly as intended. Yang Wei's pride, carefully cultivated over 20 years of public reverence, couldn't easily absorb backing down from a direct challenge in front of witnesses, disciples, and Hugo, whose expression had shifted from confusion into something considerably sharper as the pieces continued falling into place. Yang Wei raised a hand, halting his disciples before they could engage, and stepped forward himself instead, divine authority beginning to gather visibly around him, as Ares' blessing responded to his intention. Chains of golden light materialized from nothing, coiling through the air with the particular menace of a weapon designed specifically to bind and restrain, rather than simply damage. He told the stranger, voice hardening with something between genuine anger and barely suppressed fear, that impersonating a fallen hero was a crime he intended to punish personally. The chains lashed forward, faster than anything an ordinary opponent could reasonably dodge, designed to wrap and immobilize before real combat even began. Li Jian caught the first chain in one hand without visible strain, the divine metal hissing faintly against his skin without actually managing to bind him the way it was designed to. He caught the second in his other hand a moment later, and simply held them both, watching Yang Wei's expression shift rapidly from confidence into something considerably more uncertain. He said, quietly enough that only those closest could hear clearly, that this was the same authority Yang Wei had once used to help defend civilians, 20 years ago, before it apparently became a tool for extortion and cover-ups instead. He pulled sharply on both chains, yanking Yang Wei forward off balance, and drove a single measured strike into his chest that sent him skidding backward across the cracked pavement, hard enough to leave a visible furrow in the stone. Yang Wei recovered quickly, years of genuine combat experience asserting itself despite the shock of that first exchange, and summoned a weapon directly from his sanctuary's divine armory, a ram-headed war spear wreathed in golden fire. He came forward with considerably more caution this time, testing rather than committing fully, clearly attempting to assess exactly what he was actually facing. Li Jian met every strike without retreating a single step, deflecting the spear's flaming edge with his bare forearm in a way that should have caused severe injury and instead left barely a mark against skin that 20 years of tower survival had rendered considerably more durable than anything Yang Wei's experience had prepared him to expect. The exchange intensified rapidly from there, Yang Wei drawing increasingly on his sanctuary's full divine authority, golden light and flame wreathing every strike as he pushed harder, faster, clearly recognizing that half measures wouldn't work against whatever this opponent had become. Li Jian absorbed each escalation without matching it initially, allowing Yang Wei to exhaust himself against a defense that simply refused to yield. Only when Yang Wei's assault reached something approaching his genuine limit did Li Jian finally respond in kind, his own serpent aura flaring outward with enough pressure that several disciples watching from the crowd's edge actually stumbled backward as though physically pushed. He caught Yang Wei's next spear thrust between two fingers, exactly as he'd done with the disciple's blade days earlier, and this time didn't release it gently. He shattered the weapon entirely, golden fragments scattering across the pavement, and drove his opponent backward with a single open palm strike that sent him crashing through a nearby market stall, hard enough to collapse it completely. Somewhere in the distance, high above the confrontation, something vast and divine stirred uneasily. Yang Wei's connection to his patron god flickered, that ever-present source of borrowed strength suddenly hesitant in a way it had never been before, as though the Ares god itself had sensed exactly what stood opposing its chosen saint, and found the prospect considerably more alarming than any calamity it had ever authorized its saint to fight. Yang Wei staggered upright from the wreckage, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow, staring at his opponent with dawning horror that had finally overwhelmed every last trace of denial he'd been clinging to. He said, voice barely above a whisper now, that it truly was him, that Li Jian had actually survived. Li Jian walked forward slowly, closing the distance without hurry, entirely unbothered by whatever remaining fight Yang Wei might attempt. He told him that surviving had never been the difficult part. The difficult part had been 20 years spent wondering why nobody who called themselves his family had bothered looking for him, only to discover the answer had nothing to do with impossibility and everything to do with convenience. Yang Wei had no response ready for that. For the first time in 20 years of carefully rehearsed public grief, he found himself facing the one person capable of exposing exactly how hollow that performance had always been, and he had absolutely no strategy prepared for it. Li Jian told him this confrontation was only the beginning. Every sanctuary built on his supposed death would answer for it eventually. Ares would simply be first. Yang Wei's remaining disciples stood frozen near the supermarket's ruined entrance, weapons still drawn but none of them making any move to intervene. Whatever loyalty or duty had brought them here, clearly hadn't accounted for watching their saint dismantled this thoroughly in front of a gathering crowd, and none of them seemed eager to volunteer as the next demonstration. Yang Wei pulled himself fully upright, wiping blood from his eyebrow with the back of one trembling hand. Something in his posture had changed completely from the confident authority he'd carried into this confrontation minutes earlier. He looked, for the first time in longer than most people present had ever witnessed, genuinely afraid. He reached instinctively for his connection to the Ares constellation, drawing on the divine well that had fueled every victory of his career, every public display of strength that built the reputation he'd spent 2 decades protecting. The response came slower than it should have, thinner, like a well running dry at the exact moment he needed it most. He felt it clearly, his own god's presence retreating rather than strengthening, some ancient and instinctive fear rippling backward through their bond the moment it brushed too close to whatever Li Jian had become. A saint drew power through faith and divine connection. That connection required the god's willing participation, and right now, Yang Wei's god wanted no part of what stood before them. Li Jian watched this play out with quiet understanding, having felt the same hesitation ripple through the air moments earlier. He said, almost conversationally, that even Yang Wei's god recognized what remained of the old order, and had decided fear made more sense than pride. Yang Wei said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like exactly the desperate excuse it would be. A sudden shift in the air interrupted whatever remained of the standoff, gold light gathering several paces away with the particular weight that accompanied genuine divine manifestation rather than a saint's borrowed blessing. Apollo appeared fully formed within seconds, radiant and imposing in the way gods generally insisted on being, his attention immediately fixed on Li Jian rather than his own supposed champion. The god's expression carried none of Yang Wei's fear, though something more careful and calculating moved behind his eyes as he studied the situation. He addressed Li Jian directly, voice carrying easily despite its measured volume, asking whether the rumors reaching every corner of divine awareness over these past days held any truth. Whether the strongest of the old 12 had genuinely returned from a tower everyone assumed had claimed him permanently. Li Jian met the god's gaze without any particular reverence, an omission that clearly registered with several onlookers still processing exactly how casually this stranger treated an actual deity's presence. He said that Apollo could see the truth standing directly in front of him, and that verifying it through questions felt like wasted effort better spent elsewhere. Apollo's expression flickered with something that might have been amusement, or possibly irritation, though he masked it quickly behind practiced neutrality. He said he simply wished to confirm matters properly before allowing further conflict to escalate without appropriate oversight. Divine affairs, he added, required a certain procedural respect that mortal impatience rarely appreciated. Hugo stepped forward at that point, positioning himself slightly between the god and his old friend, voice carrying more authority than his relatively modest sanctuary rank usually commanded. He said that oversight felt considerably less urgent than addressing what Yang Wei had actually done over the past 20 years, and that perhaps divine attention would be better directed toward the corruption already exposed, rather than toward slowing down accountability for it. Apollo's attention shifted toward Hugo with mild surprise, apparently not accustomed to a Sagittarius disciple speaking with such directness in his presence. He didn't respond immediately, weighing something behind his composed expression, before finally inclining his head slightly, a gesture that read as reluctant acknowledgement rather than genuine agreement. Li Jian, uninterested in extending this particular exchange further, turned his attention fully back toward Yang Wei, who still hadn't managed to recover his earlier composure. He told Apollo, without looking away from his actual target, that whatever divine procedures existed could proceed however they needed to, but that his own business with Yang Wei remained unfinished, regardless of any god's opinion on the matter. Apollo's jaw tightened slightly at being so casually dismissed, though he made no move to intervene further, apparently deciding that direct confrontation with whatever power Li Jian now carried wasn't worth testing today. Yang Wei, watching his own patron god decline to intervene on his behalf, seemed to finally understand exactly how alone he now stood. He straightened as much as his battered posture allowed, some final scrap of dignity apparently refusing to let him simply collapse in front of this many witnesses. He said, voice steadier than it had any right to be given everything else, that whatever Li Jian intended to do next, he should understand that Ares' sanctuary would not simply allow one man to dismantle 20 years of established order without resistance. Li Jian studied him for a long moment before answering. He said that resistance would only delay the inevitable, and that Yang Wei should spend whatever time remained to him considering exactly how thoroughly he intended to cooperate once the reckoning properly began. He didn't wait for a response. He turned instead toward the gathered crowd, toward the disciples and officials and civilians who'd witnessed enough of this confrontation to understand that something fundamental had just shifted in a world they'd assumed was settled 20 years ago. He told them, simply, that Ares Sanctuary's leadership had built its wealth and reputation on stolen achievements, fabricated relics, and a willingness to sacrifice civilian lives whenever protecting their own image proved convenient. He told them evidence existed to prove every claim, and that it would surface publicly regardless of whatever Yang Wei attempted in the meantime. The murmurs rippling through the crowd carried a different weight now, shifting from stunned disbelief toward something considerably more dangerous for a sanctuary built entirely on carefully maintained public trust. Yang Wei's remaining composure finally broke entirely at that, something desperate flashing across his expression before he forced it back down. He gestured sharply to his disciples, ordering a full retreat rather than risking further public humiliation, and departed the scene with as much dignity as circumstances allowed, which wasn't very much at all. Apollo lingered a moment longer, studying Li Jian with an expression that had shifted from cautious verification into something more genuinely thoughtful. He said, before finally departing himself, that divine attention would remain fixed on these developments closely, and that Li Jian should understand his actions now carried consequences reaching considerably beyond simple mortal politics. Li Jian didn't dignify that with much of a response beyond a short nod, watching the god's light fade from the courtyard with the same disinterest he'd shown throughout the entire exchange. Hugo approached once the immediate chaos settled, expression caught somewhere between lingering shock and something warmer finally breaking through. He asked, quietly, what came next? Li Jian considered the question seriously, glancing once toward the direction Yang Wei's retreat had taken. He said the ledger he'd recovered from the satellite storage building represented only a fraction of what Ares' sanctuary had actually stolen and hidden away. The real proof, the genuine weight of evidence needed to bring this entire fabricated legacy crashing down publicly and permanently, would be found only within the main sanctuary's private vault. Hugo's expression sharpened with understanding. He said that vault sat behind considerable security, protected by both physical guards and divine wards specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of intrusion. Li Jian's answer carried the flat, unbothered certainty of a man who'd spent 20 years surviving considerably worse obstacles than mortal security measures. He said security measures built to stop ordinary intruders had never been designed with him in mind, and that Yang Wei's retreat tonight bought him nothing beyond a slightly longer wait, before losing everything anyway. Hugo studied his old friend for a long moment, something settling into his own expression that looked very much like the beginning of genuine resolve, rather than simple relief at his survival. He said he wanted to help, not out of guilt, though guilt certainly played its part, but because watching what Ares had truly become over these 20 years made clear that this fight extended considerably beyond Li Jian's personal grievances alone. Li Jian regarded him carefully, remembering clearly the difference between allies who fled when danger arrived and the rare few who stayed regardless of cost. He said Hugo's help would be useful, provided he understood exactly how dangerous the coming days would become, as more sanctuaries inevitably learned the truth and began preparing their own defenses. Hugo's answering nod carried the same steady determination Li Jian remembered from decades earlier, back when both of them were considerably younger and the world felt simpler than it had any right to now. Night had fully settled over the city by the time they finally left the wrecked supermarket behind, disciples and officials still working to process everything that had unfolded within these walls. Li Jian walked in comfortable silence beside the first ally he'd truly trusted since waking beneath the tower's rubble, mind already turning toward the considerable challenge waiting inside Ares Sanctuary's most heavily guarded vault. Somewhere ahead, behind walls built to keep out exactly this kind of threat, evidence of 2 decades of theft and corruption sat waiting to be exposed. Somewhere behind him, a god's fear and a saint's broken composure had already begun spreading word through divine and mortal circles alike that the world's assumptions about who held real power were about to change dramatically. Li Jian had no particular interest in how quickly that word spread. Whatever came next, sanctuary or god or ancient calamity alike, he intended to meet it with the same patient, methodical resolve that had carried him through 20 years of solitary survival. The vault could wait until morning. Tonight, for the first time since emerging from that collapsed tower, he allowed himself the small, unfamiliar comfort of walking beside someone who actually understood exactly what surviving that betrayal had cost him. Morning arrived with a pale gray light that suited the mood settling over the city better than any sunrise should have. Li Jian stood at the edge of a quiet rooftop overlooking Ares Sanctuary's main compound, studying the layout with the same patient calculation he'd once applied to mapping the Devil Tower's shifting corridors. Hugo crouched beside him, having spent most of the walk here explaining everything he knew about the vault's defenses, information gathered from years of quiet, unofficial curiosity about a sanctuary he'd never fully trusted even before learning the full truth. The main hall rose before them in polished white stone, ram-horned banners hanging from every visible window, a monument built specifically to project unshakable authority. Guards patrolled the outer walls in predictable rotations, disciplined but unremarkable, clearly designed to intimidate ordinary intruders rather than anyone capable of what Li Jian had already demonstrated twice in the past 2 days. Hugo pointed toward a lower section near the compound's eastern wing, explaining that rumor placed the vault somewhere beneath the main worship hall, protected by both physical guards and a divine ward keyed specifically to Ares' bloodline authority. Li Jian studied the described location for a long moment before answering. He said wards built around bloodline authority meant little to someone who no longer answered to any of the old 12 constellations. They moved before the guard's rotation completed its next cycle, Li Jian scaling the outer wall with an ease that made Hugo's own considerable climbing ability look clumsy by comparison. 2 guards near the vault entrance noticed movement a heartbeat too late, collapsing silently under strikes calibrated precisely enough to incapacitate without permanent harm. Li Jian had no interest in punishing men simply following orders they likely didn't fully understand. The vault door itself pulsed faintly with golden warding light, intricate script covering every surface in patterns designed to burn intruders lacking proper authorization. Hugo hesitated at the threshold, warning that triggering the ward directly would likely summon reinforcements within moments. Li Jian pressed his palm flat against the door's center without hesitation. The golden script flared violently, straining against a presence it clearly hadn't been designed to recognize or repel. For a moment, nothing happened beyond that furious pulse of light, the ward testing itself against a will considerably stronger than any bloodline authority it had ever been calibrated to measure. Then, with a groan of protesting stone, the door simply gave way, golden script shattering into harmless sparks, as the mechanism failed entirely, rather than continuing to resist. Inside, the vault revealed itself in layers of accumulated wealth and stolen legacy, shelves lined with relics, far more numerous than anything he'd found in the satellite storage building days earlier. Golden light-illuminated glass cases holding weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial artifacts, each labeled with the same elaborate, fabricated titles designed to inspire reverence in visiting disciples. He moved through the collection methodically, Hugo following close behind, cataloging genuine divine signatures against the overwhelming majority of fakes surrounding them. Most items carried no real power whatsoever, elaborate props supporting a mythology built entirely on borrowed and stolen credibility. A handful, tucked toward the vault's rear section behind additional protective wards, radiated something considerably more authentic. He found it eventually, nestled within a locked display case positioned prominently at the vault's center, a curved blade he recognized instantly despite 2 decades of separation, its edge still carrying the faint resonance of battles fought long before any tower swallowed his old life whole. The tag beside it read Sacred Blade of Sacrifice, recovered from the Devil Tower incident, preserved in memory of the fallen. Recovered, the tag claimed, as though Yang Wei had bravely retrieved it from tragedy, rather than simply looting it from a friend he'd left to die. Li Jian shattered the case and lifted the blade free, feeling something settle into place the moment his fingers closed around its familiar grip. Genuine divine energy responded immediately, recognizing its true owner after 20 years of dormant imprisonment behind glass and false reverence. The moment his hand closed fully around the hilt, something shifted throughout the entire weapon. Dormant power finally awakening after decades of forced silence. Light traced along the blade's edge, revealing intricate detail that had remained hidden beneath the weapon's dulled surface. An entire second layer of craftsmanship activating in response to its rightful wielder's touch. His system chimed with unusual insistence, notification flooding his vision with considerably more detail than any previous alert. Divine artifact fully recovered. Sacred Fang. Latent production function unlocked. Personal workshop access granted. He examined this new interface curiously, finding an entirely unfamiliar section within his system's structure, one clearly connected directly to the recovered blade's true nature. A workshop, exactly as the earlier fragmentary notification had promised, offering crafting, dismantling, repair, and reinforcement capabilities he hadn't previously possessed access to. Hugo watched the light show with visible awe, admitting he'd never witnessed anything quite like this level of dormant power reactivation before, even among the genuine relics he'd encountered throughout his own sanctuary career. Li Jian barely had time to process the workshop's full implications before an alarm finally sounded somewhere above them, the vault's destruction apparently triggering a secondary security measure independent of the primary ward. Footsteps thundered down the stairwell leading into the vault's chamber, considerably more guards than the 2 he'd disabled outside. He gathered what remained of his stolen legacy quickly, prioritizing the genuine artifacts over the elaborate fakes surrounding them, and turned to face the incoming reinforcements with the same unhurried confidence that had defined every confrontation since his return. The guards who arrived moments later found themselves facing a chamber already stripped of its most valuable contents. A stranger and a familiar Sagittarius disciple standing amid scattered debris and shattered display cases. Their leader, recognizing the severity of the breach immediately, ordered an attack without hesitation. What followed lasted considerably less time than the confrontation deserved given the guards' evident training. Li Jian moved through their ranks efficiently, incapacitating each in turn without drawing his newly recovered blade at all, apparently unwilling to waste its reawakened edge on opponents this thoroughly outmatched. A final commotion near the vault's entrance announced fresh arrivals, and this time Li Jian recognized the signature immediately. Pichu, Yang Wei's personal avatar, manifested fully within the chamber, its form radiating borrowed divine authority, considerably more dangerous than any ordinary guard's training could match. The avatar attacked without preamble, clearly understanding orders to eliminate any threat to the vault regardless of cost. Li Jian met its opening assault with his newly awakened blade for the first time, testing its reforged edge against genuine divine resistance rather than mundane guards. The Sacred Fang responded beautifully, cutting through the avatar's defensive barriers with considerably more ease than his bare hands alone might have managed. His system flickered with new information mid-battle, senses sharpened by the blade's reawakened power revealing weak points along the avatar's construction that hadn't been visible moments earlier, seams where its borrowed divinity connected imperfectly to whatever physical form it currently maintained. He exploited those weak points ruthlessly, driving the avatar backward through successive strikes until it finally collapsed, its physical manifestation destabilizing rapidly as the connection sustaining it began failing. Before the avatar's form could fully dissolve back into whatever divine essence created it, his system offered something entirely unexpected. A prompt flickered into existence, offering an option he hadn't known was even possible. Claim ownership. Convert defeated avatar. He hesitated only briefly before accepting, curiosity outweighing whatever caution might otherwise have given him pause. The avatar's form shuddered violently, its borrowed connection to Ares severing entirely as something else took hold instead, his own serpent aura flooding into the space Yang Wei's authority had previously occupied. When the transformation finished, the creature that remained bore only passing resemblance to its original form, reshaped subtly by whatever new authority now claimed it. He studied his newly acquired avatar for a long moment, considering names with the same practical directness he applied to most decisions. He settled eventually on something considerably less dignified than the creature's original threatening designation, a small private joke aimed squarely at whatever remained of Yang Wei's wounded pride. He named it Piggy. Hugo laughed despite the chaos still surrounding them, the sound carrying genuine warmth that hadn't fully surfaced since their reunion the previous day. They left the ruined vault behind shortly after, Li Jian's newly acquired blade, workshop access, and avatar, all representing considerably more progress than he'd expected to achieve this early in his campaign against the Old Order. Behind them, Ares Sanctuary's most heavily guarded secret now lay exposed and ransacked, its collected lies scattered across a chamber floor for whoever discovered the wreckage first. That evening, settled within the modest shelter he and Hugo had claimed on the city's outskirts, Li Jian finally explained the full truth of what happened inside the Devil Tower, filling in details he'd previously kept deliberately vague. He described the endless cycle of Scarlet Eyes reviving beyond any natural explanation, the deeper truth eventually uncovered regarding the Tower Administrator's role in sustaining that impossible resurrection, and the final confrontation that nearly cost him everything before granting him whatever strange new nature he now carried. Hugo listened without interrupting, expression shifting through horror, grief, and eventually something steadier as the full scope of what his old friend had survived alone finally settled properly into understanding. When Li Jian finished, Hugo asked quietly what came next, now that Yang Wei's humiliation and the vault's exposure had already set considerable change into motion. Li Jian considered the question while turning his newly recovered blade slowly in the firelight, watching its reforged edge catch and hold flickering shadows. He said that exposing Yang Wei alone accomplished nothing if the remaining 11 saints simply continued operating exactly as they always had. Real change required considerably more than personal revenge against one man, however satisfying that revenge might feel individually. He gathered the ledger recovered from the satellite building alongside additional evidence claimed from the vault itself, compiling everything into a single comprehensive record documenting 2 decades of systematic theft, exploitation, and cover-up. His system's newly discovered evidence compilation feature proved considerably useful here, organizing scattered proof into something considerably more damning than any individual piece could achieve alone. He sent copies to every major news outlet still operating within the city before dawn broke, alongside a personal message written in his own unmistakable handwriting, one that handwriting analysts would confirm within hours belonged unmistakably to a man the world had spent 20 years believing dead. By mid-morning, the entire city buzzed with news that would soon spread considerably further. The supposedly deceased strongest of the 12 Zodiac Saints had returned, had already defeated Yang Wei personally, and had exposed evidence of corruption reaching deep into Ares Sanctuary's foundation. Panic rippled through Sanctuary circles, with considerably more speed and severity than Yang Wei's earlier isolated concern had managed to convey. The Aquarius Saint, having already increased her own security based on nothing more than instinct and old memory, found her private fears fully validated within hours of the news breaking publicly. Other saints scrambled toward damage control, toward hurried consultations regarding exactly how much of their own conduct over the past 20 years might similarly withstand public scrutiny should Li Jian turn his attention their direction next. Li Jian, watching the growing chaos unfold from a quiet rooftop overlooking the city he'd once sworn to protect, felt something settle into place that had been missing since the moment he'd realized every ally he trusted had abandoned him to face Scarlet Eyes alone. Purpose, clarified now beyond simple survival or personal vengeance alone. Hugo joined him eventually, watching the same skyline, the same distant plumes of activity building around sanctuaries, suddenly forced to reckon with consequences they'd assumed permanently buried alongside a man they'd left to die. He asked what Li Gion intended to do about the remaining 10 saints who'd participated equally in that original betrayal, beyond Yang Wei, who'd already answered for his particular share. Li Gion's answer carried the same quiet, unshakable certainty that had carried him through 20 years of solitary survival against odds that should have killed him 1,000 times over. He said every single one of them would eventually face the same reckoning, in whatever order, circumstance, and opportunity presented them. Some might prove genuinely repentant, as Hugo himself had proven despite his own passive role in that day's failures. Most, he suspected, would prove considerably more like Yang Wei, willing to hide behind divine authority and manufactured reputation, rather than face what they'd actually done. Either way, the world that had rebuilt itself so comfortably around his supposed death was about to discover exactly how thoroughly that comfortable arrangement was ending. Somewhere across the city, word had already begun reaching the remaining Zodiac Saints individually, each processing the same impossible news through the lens of their own particular guilt and fear. A war was beginning, one considerably larger than a single grudge against a single betrayer, and every saint who'd chosen convenient silence over inconvenient loyalty 20 years ago would soon discover exactly what price that silence had finally come due to collect.